This is the third video lecture on the topic of middle adulthood, the years between ages 40 and 65. At this period of time, so a lot of families or a lot of married couples are seeing their children leave home, which we sometimes refer to as the empty nest. And what's interesting about this phenomena is that this is actually a time of increasing marital satisfaction. So, as I probably have said in other video lectures, that when children are teenagers, marital satisfaction actually begins to plummet. So depending on what stage or what age a couple has had their children, they may be coming into their middle adult years with increasing marital satisfaction. And to some degree, some statistics or some studies suggest that people are actually more satisfied in their 40s and their 50s than they are in their 20s. I mean, I can kind of attest to this. I'm actually more happy in my marriage now than I was 10, 15, probably even 20 years ago. But now divorce does still happen, right? Divorce is still happening. But one of the interesting observations is that divorcees in midlife appear to actually do better or recover. They're more adaptable than divorcees that are in younger years. And your textbook doesn't offer an explanation as to why. But I think one could theorize that if you've been married in an unsatisfactory relationship, you have probably figured out coping strategies as to how, or you've imagined what life would be like, if you divorced. So it's just really a matter of making happen what you've already been thinking about, and a lot of couples do in fact divorce when the children graduate from high school. And so it's now this wouldn't necessarily be true if a divorce just happened to you and you didn't see it coming, and that does happen to people. It's actually more likely to happen to men because women file for about 2 out of 3 divorces. So, and yeah, anyway, but the number one cause of divorce in midlife is abuse, and that kind of makes sense too, that the children grow up, they graduate from high school, you're tired of putting up with all this emotional abuse or physical violence, and so you cut your ties somewhere around midlife. But anyway, and then when one is younger, one still may have this romantic notion of what marriage life is going to be. So we've already just referred to this phenomenon of empty nest syndrome. And again, this is a little bit like the midlife crisis. It's one of these things that may be sort of inflated or exaggerated. Certainly there is a period of probably sadness and loneliness for the typical stay-at-home mom or the stay-at-home parent who has done, their whole life has been devoted to caregiving and taking care of the children. And when there's no children to care for anymore, of course, depending on how many kids and how old they are, this may sort of come as a relief. But probably for traditional women, this would be more of a problem. Fathers often report having some sadness or regret, and it may boil down to having spent not enough time with their children. I know my husband talks about that, that, wow, he wishes he'd gone to more basketball games and watched our daughter cheer. And I feel like, I went to every single one. So, I feel like I totally ate it up. I really enjoyed being a parent, and I don't know that I do miss it. I wouldn't call it a syndrome necessarily, but I really did enjoy being an involved mom. But on the other hand, this is also a period where we call it the end of the chronic emergency of parenthood. Parenthood is this constant meeting the needs, emotional needs, material needs, of someone who, at least for a period of time, is completely dependent, and that can be very exhausting. So as I mentioned in a previous lecture, this can be a time of, oh my gosh, I have time to myself, right? I don't know quite what to do with myself. Now, this is also a period where children may launch, they may leave home, and they may come back. And the term for that that's offered in your textbook is the boomerang children. Sometimes it's called a revolving door syndrome. I've referred to it in other lectures, I think, as the adult-escent. So that's putting together adolescent and adult. I have an adult-escent at home. He is 28 years old and he lives in the basement, and he has a full-time job, and he spends his money on like VR equipment. But to be completely honest, I love having him there. I enjoy the fact that he doesn't want to run away from home and run away from his parents. So some scholars, there's this big sort of debate: is this good or is this bad? I don't have an answer for that. I know it doesn't really bother me. Sandwich generation is, and this is a quiz question too. Quiz question right here. Sandwich generation. What is the sandwich generation? This refers to the generation of people. So I would be the sandwich generation who takes care of both their children and their adult parents. So I recall when my daughter was about 9, and my mother lived with us, right? And a lot of this, you don't necessarily have to have your parents living with you, but I remember my mother was living with us, and her room was downstairs, and my mother was upset about something, and she was crying. She was standing at the top of the stairs in the kitchen crying, and I turned around, and my daughter, who's 9, is also crying. And I remember thinking, when do I get a cry, right? So I was in the middle. You're sandwiched between taking care of your children and taking care of your parents. And it can be exhausting. It can be emotionally draining. It can challenge. It can add a lot of household stress. I mean, and in dynamics like that, like the relationship that gets the least attention is usually the marriage relationship, right? And so one thing that this refers to what we call caregiver burnout, and that's where you're trying to manage taking care of, all of these people that are demanding your attention. And usually it's the women, but it's not always the women. A couple other terms that are offered in your textbook that I think are useful to know is this I can't say it, family, right? Maturity. And that is basically when we come to terms with that our parents are dependent on us, that they need our help. And I think because for our whole life, we have turned to our parents to help us. This can be quite an eye-opening realization, to realize that your parents they need your help, right? And then similarly, you have this concept of crisis, and that is, how do you balance this, right? Because you can't you have to balance this. I have my own family I have to take care of. My mother and father need my help. I'm obligated to help them out of duty because they've helped me, but yet at the same time, you kind of have to maintain some distance, right? I mean, some families struggle with, do they move their parents back into their house? My mother's lived with us twice. Fortunately, my husband's been completely okay with that, but he's also said he doesn't want his mother living with us. So it's this crisis, and I've been lucky because I have a partner that has been willing to have that kind of caregiving relationship with my mother. And in some cases, you might not have a partner that's willing to do that. Okay, and the last slide then is just a brief little reference to siblings and grandparenting. Grandparenting, interestingly enough, and I was trying to do this math in my head, the average age of a grandparent the average age in the United States for people to become a grandparent is 45 years old. I don't know what that says to you. To me, that's like seems really young. But then I think about my mother was 45 when she was a grandparent. I'm a long ways away from being a grandparent, but I'm over the age of 45. But then I have friends I went to high school who are. So anyway, kinship care is a concept that refers to, it's probably a legal term, but it refers to the fact that grandparents, if they're not foster grandparents, have no legal rights to their grandchildren. So your grandchildren might live with you or spend an enormous amount of time with you, or you may have caregived them, but you have no legal rights, like in divorce or visitation rights or anything like this, right? So it's and there's another concept that's not referred to in your textbook, that's also really important, that comes actually from evolutionary psychology, and it's called the grandmother hypothesis. And the grandmother hypothesis says that in societies, well, basically, grandmothers increase the odds that a child will survive. And they apply that to sort of cross culturally from society to society. But I think you could also apply that on a more individualized level, that when any child has a grandparent, somebody to help raise them or to help take care of them or to help socialize them, that increases the odds of their well-being and survival. And for a lot of families, this is the way that they engage in that that word that I couldn't say previous, a couple lectures ago, but that's how we give back to the next generation, is by raising grandchildren or being involved in their lives. And I've heard, many grandparents say they were better grandparents than they were parents. Well, and that makes sense because you're at a different stage in your life. You're not dedicated to your career. You're not trying to pay rent, and you can interact with a child for the sake of just their emotional and their social development. And you don't have to, what they say is that you can play with them and then send them back, right, at the end of the day. So you can have a very different relationship with your grandchildren. In the discussion, I think I've asked you about what kind of relationship you had with your grandparents. And then finally, we have siblings. I can't speak much to siblings because I don't have any. But one thing that, to note about your sibling is this is, for better or for worse, your sibling relationship will be the longest family relationship of your life, right? So your parents will eventually die. You will die before your children die, but the odds that you will spend your most, if not nearly all of your life, potentially in a relationship with your siblings. And, there is this, what they call it, bottleneck phenomena. So you're going to spend a lot of time with them when you're a child. You're going to get to your young adulthood where you have your own kids and you got to take care of your own kids, and less time perhaps with them. And then at later adulthood, you're going to spend more time with them. I thought that was interesting too, because that's exactly the experience that my father had with his sister. Growing up, I didn't even know hardly anything at all about my aunt or my cousin, because they were at that bottleneck, right? But as they got towards their end of life, they spent a lot of time together. So, okay, so this wraps up the chapter on middle adulthood. It's not necessarily a crisis. It all is kind of informed by the patterns and the relationship that we've established earlier in life.